everybody, and welcome to Pods of War, the podcast from the University of Wolverhampton War Studies Department. I'm Spencer Jones, and I'm joined as always by my friends and colleagues, Howard Fuller and John Buckley. And John, you're the focus of today, because I understand you've seen a film recently, and that film was Top Gun Maverick, and you've got some pretty strong opinions on it, I understand. But before we get into that, what did you like about it? Did you enjoy it at all?
Yes and no. It was an interesting experience because it wasn't my idea to go and see it, and there is an interesting gender dynamic to this film, and indeed the original Top Gun, which is all seen as being a big macho film and everything. But actually, quite a lot of women go for this film. I mean, I'm talking gross generalizations here, but in a big way, it's kind of identified as an iconic 80s movie, and this is why Julia, my wife, wanted to go and see it, and she was much more determined to go see it than I was. And one of my favourite journalists and authors, Hadley Freeman, who writes for The Guardian, wrote a book a few years ago, and it's all about 80s iconic films. And usually with a feminist spin, what it's... But she's a really big fan of Top Gun, which is really bizarre because it's not the kind of film you'd expect to capture that kind of essence. But she saw something in it, and my wife wanted to go and see it. So I grudgingly agreed to go and see it with a degree of trepidation. It was interesting in lots of ways, and some parts of it were really impressive. And I'm not saying for a moment it's a bad film. It's a film which has grossed over $1 billion worldwide since it's come out. So it's made about $900 million profit. So this is a film which has been very well received in terms of box office and so on. So so it's not necessarily a bad film, but there were some elements of it which were good and some which were not so good and worth considering. I mean, the good parts, the best part about it, the best thing about it was that it captured an essence of flying and aerial combat in a way that lots of recent films of this nature would not, because my understanding is they didn't use CGI or anything like that. They actually flew real aeroplanes and had shots and cameras and things inside F-18s and things that were flying around all over the place. And it looked really impressive because of that. So it really captures that essence in a really positive way. And Tom Cruise, he's a big film star. He plays Tom Cruise, and he's good in that particular role, in that particular part. He's an actor who gets hammered in a lot of ways for just playing the same part all the time, but he can act. He was brilliant in Rain Man. He was really good in those films that established him. He's just become more and more of a film star ever since. So here he's playing that kind of Tom Cruise-y, Pete Maverick Mitchell character again, and it's the same kind of essence and everything. But it got a response. It's a mixed audience. There were boys and girls watching it. Julia cried at the relatively important moments in the film. I kind of sighed at various
Did you
moments.
also cry at those moments?
I did not. I might have cried inwardly at certain moments, but not the same ones. So I'm not saying it's a bad film. There are elements which make you... I suppose, the stuff about the whole macho culture thing is interesting, and what it represents. But it's... There were just other aspects of it which were slightly unbelievable, and I do wonder about the emphasis on the macho imagery and culture and so on, which interestingly is different in this film. I mean, it's a long time since I saw the original Top Gun film. I think I've only ever got through it once, and the kind of the gender dynamic on it was quite important and interesting as well. That there are female pilots. As of, that's 20, 25 years at least, I think, since female pilots were flying these kind of aircraft and things in the US. So that was captured quite well. So it's not quite as hardcore macho as the original film was. There were some good points to it. I'm not saying it was something which I'd say don't ever go and watch this film.
Well, John,
but
in terms of the
let's get down to it here, really. Let's get down to it here. We're not on this podcast to praise this film. I know this. Why don't you tell the listeners what really annoyed you about this film?
Well, it was still it was still very macho and dynamic man of action kind of stuff in an over the top unbelievable way. And there are two things really which kind of irritated me about it. The first was, and this is a constant beef I have. You've heard me going about this before. You know that I got furious at the film Fury because of the way in which they portray and have people playing parts which they couldn't possibly have done because they're way too old. Now, Tom Cruise might not look 59. He doesn't look 59. He's very well preserved. He's a very fine specimen of male humanity. And it's he could quite easily get away with playing a character much younger than him. But the character has to be in their late 50s in order to match it with the fact that they were flying in the mid-80s, these kind of things. So let's assume he's in his early 20s then when they were doing all that kind of stuff. It makes him now 35, 36 years later, knocking 60. So he's actually playing somebody about the right kind of age. The problem with that is somebody who's knocking 60 cannot fly a fighter jet and pull the kind of G's and all the kind of physical stresses and things that he does in the film. If he'd just been in a kind of a role in which he's telling others what to do, or directing things or something like that, yeah, fine, maybe there's something in that. However, he ends up flying F-18s and pulling ridiculous manoeuvres and doing amazing things and beating all these other pilots who are 35 years younger than him and showing them what to do. So I don't know. I just don't think it's very honest that you have somebody of that age doing those kind of things. It just doesn't happen. In the same way that Brad Pitt, at 51 at the time, Brad Pitt's the same age as me. I know it's unbelievable, but he is.
I know, you look far younger than Brad Pitt.
Absolutely, yeah. But he was driving a tank in northwest Europe I think it's set in April 1945 in the film Fury. And the average age of that crew is about 38. Ludicrous and insulting because the guys who actually do the fighting are about 20 to 25, or younger, 18 to 25. That's the age group. But people don't want to see that. They don't want to see young people being killed in war films and things. But it's okay for big, hunky guys, who much older, much more identifiable. So this panders to that a little bit, which I found annoying. The other angle on it is the thing which is just, you despair, is the idea that Maverick, or Tom Cruise, whilst no one's looking, just goes and pinches an F-18, disobeying all his orders, all the chain of command. He just takes the F-18 and flies the kind of practice mission to prove that the way he says it could be done. And then said, oh, okay, Tom, sorry, Pete, you've done a great job there. You're going to lead the mission now. Come on. One, he's too old. Two, he wouldn't have got away with that. And he does it a couple of times in the film. This man is unsackable, where in reality, of course, it had been long gone. At the start of the film, he disobeys orders and blows up a huge project fighter, cutting-edge aeroplane and things, which goes to Mach 10 or something, over the very, some kind of
goes to warp speed.
Thing. Yeah. I think it was Mach 10 anyway. And he pushes it too far and blows the thing up. And he survives, and then said, now we're going to send you back to Top Gun school to lead some training on this mission. I'm sorry, you just put a multi-billion-dollar project. It was about to be closed down anyway. And then a couple other things. The best bit, you go and see the film just for this bit. It's like out of a Commando book.
I love Commando.
Yeah, I mean, if you're watching on that level, this works in a way because they never identify who the enemy is, and I don't think they do it in the original Top Gun film. They don't say who it is they're fighting. I think it's implied, but I don't think they do in the original. They don't in this. In the end, it's fairly clear. It looks like North. No, in terms of who the enemy are, whether it's I don't know, Russians or something like that. Then in this, it gives the impression that it's North Korea, but it is not explicitly stated. Anyway, so the Tom Cruise's mate gets shot down, saving Tom Cruise or doing something in the air action over North Korea. They're destroying some kind of secret establishment, usual kind of James Bond stuff, and he gets shot down. So Tom Cruise and this guy they both end up in North Korea behind enemy lines. What do? They
Spoilers.
It's spoilers. Yeah, they go to the local air base where the enemy's air force is flying from, and whilst no one's looking, it's been bombed and hit by missiles and things. Whilst no one's looking, they sneak onto the base and find an F-14. Just happens to be one there that they're testing, and it's fueled up, ready to go, and they jump in this aeroplane and press a couple of buttons, and suddenly they're on the runway. And a bit like when Clint Eastwood nicks the Firefox, if you remember that.
Exactly, Firefox.
Everyone's looking around. Suddenly, this jet zooms off and so on. Similar kind of thing. Zips off into space, and then he takes down some latest generation fighters with an F-14, which is like, I don't know, a Fokker triplane
because
taking
of course
down a P-51.
He can fly the planes better than they can. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely,
he's Top Gun,
of course. Yeah. So there were some elements like that where. I got to dig in the ribs from Judas. I sighed at that particular moment in the film, in between eating my munchies. At that point, it just stretched it a bit too far. So, there are just elements where it goes on too far.
Well, just you mentioning about the relative youth of characters in the film and in war films generally, just a shout out for anyone who's listening. If you want to see a film which does portray young and beautiful people being killed horribly in a war, Starship Troopers, they often misunderstood sci-fi adaptation, genuinely has that vibe, but interesting. Perhaps we can talk about that at some future point. But I wanted to come back to the idea of youth that you mentioned, because of course, Howard, you've got a family connection to fighter pilots. Could you tell the listeners a bit more about that?
That's right. My father, John Fuller, before he was a historian, flew in the Air Force between 1960 and 1965, and he flew F-101B jet interceptors. He was part of the 18th Fighter Squadron stationed at Grand Forks Air Force Base in North Dakota. And he's got photos from the time. We could share some on the screen here. And he was in his young 20s. He was very much part of that vibe. They were all, Top Gun type personalities. It was very macho. There was a lot of jockeying for position amongst themselves, amongst other figures in the Air Force. Who knows about Air Force Army Navy rivalry at the same time, and yeah, it was unabashedly chauvinist at the time as well. They, these were maverick warrior type guys who were the best of the best, and they took the greatest risks. They were pumped on adrenaline, on speed and testosterone, and they were keeping the nation safe. And it was he did sort of ride that wave for a while, and fortunately he wrote a detailed memoir later on. He never published a memoir, but it was very detailed and describing the U.S. Air Force in the early 1960s. It's quite interesting. And when I saw the original Top Gun, it's funny because I didn't quite identify Tom Cruise with my father, because I knew my father as a father figure. My father got out of the Air Force and he settled down and he had kids and a family and a home in suburbia. And that's kind of the flip side of the sort of Top Gun depiction of what it is to be a warrior in a modern military machine, this kind of thing where, someone can take bold risks and not be slapped by discipline because, he's broken the chain of command, but that's okay. The ends justify the means, apparently. He's like James Kirk, breaking the rules or, what have you. I also kind of like the rogue cop mystique. It's only when a rogue cop, takes the law into his own hands and just stops arguing and slapping people's wrists and goes out there with his 357 and gets the job done, that people can go, this is what life's all about, kind of thing.
There's a bit of nuance in the film. There's a bit of a nuance in the film about that. You're talking about your dad's backstory, the reality, and they try and do that a little bit in this film. Tom Cruise is kind of washed up. He's a captain, and his mate Val Kilmer is, I think he's CNC, the Pacific Fleet or something like that. He's really gone up the chain of command, but Tom Cruise is stuck because he's a maverick, and it's had kind of an impact on his life. So there is a little bit of that, but it's a gentle hint in that direction. But nonetheless,
I think a good contrast would be something like the 1979 film The Great Santini with Robert Duvall, which I'm not sure if he won an Academy Award or was nominated for Academy Award for that role, but that is a depiction of a fighter pilot. I think he flew F-4s in Vietnam. He was an ace. He was very courageous, lived for the service, inspired his men. But the film is about what happens when you take warriors out of that sort of, cloud that they're in, and the film's about his family life, adjusting to being a father, being a husband, mowing the grass every Sunday, this kind of thing. And some things he adopts well to, and some things he clearly hasn't. And the film chronicles that, I think, really well. And that, to me, is a lot more realistic and in many ways more interesting than Top Gun with all its bravado. I mean, the bravados, of course, that's fine. But I think, as you're suggesting, John, it's also quite disappointingly superficial, maybe, for all the technical expertise. I was going to ask you before, the good thing about Top Gun was the photography, and especially the use of, say, an American aircraft carrier to do a lot of the filming. Did they have current aircraft carriers in the Maverick film? I haven't seen it yet.
It was on the Theodore Roosevelt, so I believe so. So and whether that was actually shot on plane, but that's kind of the slightly troubling element about it is they're selling an ideal, and it's almost like a recruiting film for the U.S. Navy and U.S. naval aviators and things. But I don't know. I can see why they would do it and why they want to engage in it, and they have to send positive images because it's whatever we think about this film, it's a phenomenally difficult thing to be able to do that kind of stuff in reality. And what was interesting, I saw a podcast last week, and it was real Top Gun pilots and things who were talking about the film Top Gun Maverick, and saying that a lot of the technical stuff and the way they demonstrated things, little pieces, were actually similar to their own experiences and things. So there was clearly they'd done their research and that kind of thing. Those films are usually quite good. But yeah, the photography is what sells it. That's the best thing. And Tom Cruise is good. No, don't knock it. He carries it well within the confines of what that character does.
There's something to be said, though, as you were saying, about not just using star power and established hero icon actors like Brad Pitt or Tom Cruise to frame a story about being in the Air Force or being in the Navy, or the sort of dangers and risks and what makes success and failures and all the rest. But it's the romance over focus on the pilots when there's so many other people involved in making that pilot work. The people on the deck, the people who design planes, the people, we're constantly banging on with our Wolverhampton students that it's not just about weapons and tactics, or it's about the general's point of view. Sometimes about the common soldier's point of view, how decision making works. Things like logistics are very important to winning conflicts. Actually,
it doesn't make $1 billion at the box office, Howard. That's the problem.
You know what?
Truckers
in
space
my current issue of Naval
is
History
fine,
magazine, and sure enough, there's the plane. The current issue of Naval History magazine. Just got this 2 days ago. I mean, there it is again. I mean, we have this sort of love affair with, those men and their magnificent flying machines, kind of thing.
Well, perhaps that's a topic for a future podcast to discuss where's these ideas come from. But to finish, I'm going to go to you, John, and say, so you didn't really like Top Gun Maverick, but can you tell the listeners, do you have any recommendations for great aerial combat films that you feel meet your standards?
Oh, I wouldn't say about standards, because it's always difficult to talk about those kind of things because they are trying to do something different. But I also thought the Battle of Britain captured an essence of the disconnect in the skies when you lose contact, you're in the clouds, you've no idea what's going on and things are zipping about. And Memphis Belle, that really captures something of those kind of operations. I mean, that's Second World War. Modern stuff I wouldn't know so much about. But yeah, I like that. I'd like either of those films. For all their other flaws and faults, they capture that kind of element of it for me quite well.
Very good. And Howard, have you got any aerial combat films you'd recommend?
Well, I appreciate trying to show modern weaponry and the things that are going on right now that everyday people don't really know about, don't have access to, this kind of thing. I appreciate that, but I always have a soft spot for the more historical bits too, recreating aerial battles from decades ago, generations ago, or even 100 years ago. So I've always been a fan of like the Blue Max, at least the action sequences in the Blue Max originally. So there's a late 1960s film, and they've got biplanes and triplanes, and those are real planes, going through various action sequences. Which certainly, when I was younger, watching that kind of thing on a matinee, on TV or something, you're glued to it because these men are flying very dangerous looking things, and the planes are moving painfully slow, it seems, and circling each other and going in and out of clouds. And they're terrified. And they're getting shot down, or their planes are malfunctioning. They're crashing on takeoff, crashing on landing. And I really appreciated that kind of. We could use another really good First World War aerial combat film, for example, I think.
Yeah.
I think you could even make a case. There's been the First World War aerial combat films have generally been superior to the Second World War. Starting with Wings, even things melodramas like Dawn Patrol, which yes, it's of its era, but it's got some great sequences in it. I've got a soft spot for Aces High with Malcolm McDowell.
Oh yes,
the 70s, which is basically it's Journey's End except with fighter pilots, and there's some great sequences. That Blue Max, highly entertaining. So there's something to be said there. I do have to mention though, there was also that absolutely appalling aerial combat World War I film, Flyboys, which came out a few years ago, in which a gigantic death zeppelin was coming to destroy Paris with chemical weapons. It was awful. Don't watch it. I absolutely don't watch it. It's one of the worst films I've ever seen. But there we go. Perhaps we can discuss, go into greater depth about aerial combat films in a future podcast. Thank you very much, John, for sharing your thoughts on Top Gun, even if they weren't always positive. Thank you, Howard, for sharing your piece of family history. And thank you, the listeners, for tuning in. We'll see you soon. Thank you.